The mistake that I made then, the mistake that MJ Akbar also made, the voice of the clergy as the voice of the community. The Prime Minister's office or the government should not interfere.
What I am interested is that like the Babri Masjid and the Ayodhya has a Muslim minority connection. There also is the Kashmir where you can't discuss Kashmir without discussing the minorities.
Welcome back to OLF 2020. In this session, we have former JNU professor and Padma Shri awardee Pushpesh Pant and former IAS officer Wajahat Habibullah discussing the legacy of former Prime Minister of India Rajiv Gandhi. They will be in conversation with TNI's editorial director Prabhu Chawla and senior journalist and author Kaveri Bamzai.
Hello and welcome to the 9th edition of the Odisha Literary Festival. I have with me Wajahat Habibullah, who is in Indira Gandhi's PMO, Rajiv Gandhi's PMO, was also Chief Information Commissioner, has held a series of remarkable positions with remarkable integrity, has written a wonderful book, which I've just finished reading, My Years with Rajiv, Triumph and Tragedy. I can't tell you what a wonderful read it is, while also giving you putting you slam bang in the center of the 80s, a period of remarkable churn where everything that is good and everything that is bad in India today, in contemporary India, really started. And he's told us so many things which were revelations to me, but I don't think revelations to the two gentlemen who are with me as well. Pushpesh Pant, he has written on politics for the longest time, political scientist, and Mr. Chawla, Prabhu Chawla, who also finds a mention in the book a couple of times, as does India Today, which he then represented. So thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Habibullah, the first question to you. There is so much personal affection that you have for Rajiv Gandhi, which of course dates back to him being your senior by a year at Doon School, and the connections between your families as well. And yet you're able to distance yourself enough to see what he did right and to see what he did, which also perhaps did not have the which didn't have the implications that he'd wanted, whether it was the opening of the locks to Babri Masjid or the reversal of the Shah Banu judgment. And I think that is what is quite remarkable about the book, that it is able to be both affectionate as well as quite impartial. So talk a little about your own connection with Rajiv and really how this book came about.
Well, as I've written in my book, we were not really very close friends in school. Yes, our families knew each other well. But when I was in fact better friends with his younger brother Sanjay. But the family connection continued, and through Muhammad Yunus and others, we would meet occasionally in between till he actually came into politics when I was in the office of his mother. Uh, but getting to speak to, you see, he and I shared a very common background. I think that comes out in the book
Yeah.
because we come from that old Avadi sort of framework, and then we had gone to the same school and therefore had the similar kind of education. Therefore, I understood him very well, and because of that, and I later discovered I didn't. We often had discussions when I was traveling with him in a plane, or whenever we would find a little time to be on our own together, then we would often talk about various issues, which I was under the impression that he may have conferred with others also and spoken to others because he was a very open person. But I did find later in discussing with my colleagues that in fact there were many discussions that I had with him which showed to me certain parts of his character which nobody else knew or very few others knew. So I felt, therefore, I must write it down. And because of that, my affection for him, my affinity for him, did not really develop so closely when we were in school. As I said, we knew each other well, and I've said that he had this very typical greeting from me, "Hello, Vajahat." It would always be the same. But I began to grow very fond of him later in his life when he started opening up with me and talking to me about various issues that actually troubled him. And when you say that I have been impartial, happened also to be part of several of those decisions. Certainly on the question of Shahabano, and I've described it in detail,
Yes.
and what happened in those, and I've called that chapter "The Tapestry Unravels." And in the unraveling of that tapestry, fortunately or unfortunately, I was also participant and saw it happen. So I'm able to see now, with a lot of hindsight, things that went wrong. And also, I've tried to put the record straight in the sense that many of the things that went wrong were not what were intended.
Hmm.
Uh, I've tried to bring this out, in fact, in Panchayati Raj particularly, and we'll talk about that if somebody is interested later. But Panchayati Raj, as it exists now, is not quite the Panchayati Raj which
Yeah.
he thought of. And he thought of, and that's what's interesting, he thought of a Panchayati Raj which he came to that conclusion after a lot of discussion with me. He didn't come to Prime Ministership. He realized the importance of Panchayati Raj, but the actual way in which it has functioned, I feel that I had something to do with influencing his thinking.
But just to quickly go back to those two very critical moments, one was the Shabano judgment, and you say, in fact, that you advised him against it, and there were the two schools of thought, one represented by Arif Muhammad Khan and the other by MJ Akbar, and he sort of seemed to be going with what MJ Akbar had suggested. Talk a little more about that period and how you felt, and what has been the legacy of that.
Well, you had this decision that was taken on Shah Bano case. The details, of course, I've discussed as to what the decision was. There was an outcry at the time by the bulk of the Muslim clergy. Now, a mistake that I made then, and when I was talking now today of hindsight, the mistake that I made then, the mistake that MJ Akbar also made, was to believe, and that was because the clergy was the most vocal element of the Muslim community at that time. But we mistook the voice of the clergy as the voice of the community. Nevertheless, even assuming that this was the general feeling of the community, I had advised, and I'd advised for administrative reasons, not really for either religious or emotional reasons, that we should by no means interfere. The Prime Minister's office or the government should not interfere in a decision by the Supreme Court of India, because the Supreme Court of India was the Supreme Court, means the supreme. Any personal law or other law, maybe adjudicated, a company law, or any other form law, may be adjudicated upon by its own group of jurists or judicial officers. But so far as the Supreme Court of India is concerned, it must have license to adjudicate on every form
Right.
of law. And therefore, it should not look as though the government is interfering in a decision of the Supreme Court. If there was a mistaken decision of the Supreme Court, the parties were free to go in a review appeal, and the government would not oppose it. That was my suggestion, which I think I've written about in detail.
Yeah.
MJ Akbar's view, but also based on the same presumption as mine, that the Muslim public opinion was greatly agitated over this, which as it turned out, it was not. It was the clergy which was greatly agitated, and the leadership, Sayyid Shahabuddin and so on. He also said that, you see, this community has been your ardent supporter. You cannot now seem to show yourself as being separate from the community. You are part of this community, as you are part of every Indian community. This was the argument that won over, I think, won over Rajiv. After that meeting, which I was present in, where he met MJ Akbar, his attitude changed. Up to that time, this note which I had sent to Rajiv stayed with him, but he hadn't taken a decision. Obviously, he was consulting with others, and I have spoken to others. For example, Arif Muhammad, he spoke to him. He spoke to other members of his cabinet and things. And finally, he came to this decision as a result of this meeting with MJ Akbar. And that is why he probably asked me into his room when he was having this discussion. And I've described the details. But you see, it was a decision. Even I at that time felt that this is something that really concerns the Muslim community. Why should anyone else have any particular objection to it or not? But in fact, it had a very strong reaction
Yeah.
in other communities. And the whole tradition of what's called appeasement is now traced back to that. Although in my book I say that the roots are even earlier, but this is what is normally said now. So what happened thereafter was that there was a lot of and charges of appeasement and so on and so forth. And then you had the opening of the locks of the Babri Masjid.
Yes.
Muslims generally, and to this day, many people, I'm surprised how many people are convinced that Rajiv had come up with the opening of the locks of the Babri Masjid to actually calm down the critics on the Shahbanu. Well, as I brought out in my book, and this has been attested to by my friend Mani also, who was with Rajiv on a tour somewhere, I forget where exactly, when the court judgment was announced of opening the locks, and he was completely taken aback. And he told me that he had nothing to do with that judgment. But you will find many people saying, no, I hear that it was his own orders. Everyone is listening, I heard. They were not his orders. If they were not his orders, why didn't he simply deny it? He was the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
He was a dual school boy. Full responsibility. And this was a characteristic not only then for that decision, it was a characteristic in later times also, where he was accused of having taken a wrong decision. He was himself not responsible, but he would accept responsibility.
You talk of Operation Brass Tacks as well, and you mentioned General Sundarji being responsible for that. You mentioned Arun Nehru in a way being responsible for opening of the Babri Masjid locks, but he didn't speak up against them.
How could he? He was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Because I that's what I said. I've in fact said that in my conversation with him. I said, he said that he didn't approve of it at all. It happened without his knowledge. I said, but you were the Prime Minister.
Right.
He said yes. So that is what I'm saying, that this happened repeatedly, also in the Bofors case, and that we can come to as we go along.
Yeah.
But he took the full responsibility for all these decisions, although he was not party in brass tacks particularly.
I'll interrupt you here because because it is on 104 page where you're referring to this question, Babri Masjid gates being opened by the court order. You put him the question. Now the answer which you are giving is not in the book. That he said I have nothing to do with it, because you left that question unanswered in the book, because you are going to Gujarat according to your book. The monsoon of 1986 had turned out and we were flying to Dot area. I put him a question that had been troubling me ever since February of that year, with the ordering of the removal of locks on the gates of Babri Masjid by the local magistrate, an order that had been complied with forthwith. After that, you have just started the issue and not given the answer here.
The answer not printed, but the answer was, in fact, that I did not have anything to do with it. I've gone ahead.
He must have given you some answer which you are now saying, that he.
No, in the book also I've spoken about Arun Nehru and how he dropped him from his cabinet.
Arun Nehru is a different context. Then Arun Nehru talking about.
I've spoken about Arun Nehru in the same context about how he was dropped from the cabinet.
No, that I'm reading that chapter because I was interested in that chapter very much because.
But then you will probably find it later because he dropped Arun Nehru from the cabinet.
No, I'm saying what you are telling. I'm just putting in a context. I have nothing to do because I'm putting in context that you raised the question but not answered. But now it has been answered very specifically by you on two issues. One is MJ Akbar, who is now in the other party, which is talking about Shah Banu all the time, reversal of Shah Banu judgment and whatnot. And he was, in fact, I didn't know. In fact, you are telling me now, first time I've heard it. I have not read it. Whether it appeared earlier or not, I don't know. So MJ Akbar prevailed over Arif Muhammad Khan. That is what you are, and you as well. His Zosco friend and.
Well, not prevailed over me. I wouldn't say that because I had really left it open. My advice was much wider as to how the administration should proceed. I had not made any such recommendation. So it's not a question of prevailing over me. But yes, Arif Muhammad Khan was a person who had strongly opposed the idea. of making any amendment.
Right.
That is correct.
Yeah. You read the book very closely.
I would really like to shift focus. I think we have discussed these two issues pretty very much in detail.
Yeah.
But I think there are other aspects of the book which also are of contemporary topicality. Say, for instance, Kashmir. And that's where Mr. Habibullah was posted after his IAS, and he spent a reasonable time. And actually, the first time when I remember hearing his name in headlines was when he was the governor's advisor and met with that almost fatal accident and was in coma for months, and he continued to be the job. I think besides his proximity with Rajiv, the Doon school connection, his days in Prime Minister's office, his being an insider and seeing various people, I think the Kashmir thing needs to be also perhaps discussed with him. Like, for instance, it was quite an eye-opener for me where Mr. Habibullah categorically says that most people in this country think that Sheikh Abdullah and his National Conference were participating in Indian freedom struggle. He's explicit. They were not doing that. Their movement, their struggle for freedom against, for abolition of feudalism and abolition of princely estate of the Dogra princes, Hari Singh's regime, oppressive regime at all. So this myth, which is quite different because while Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his nephew Yunus Chacha, as he says, were part of the Indian freedom struggle, the Kashmir people's struggle was against the royalty there, against the feudal oppression there. So there is one part. But then he again says something that which is not available in the archives here, that much Abdullah family is maligned all the time, that they were in league with Chester Bowles, with CIA and so on. So if one reads that chapter about Kashmir, Mr. Habibullah also says that now the archival material available abroad gives a lie to this myth that there was this collusion between CIA and there. But there is an interesting detail here also. He says that Mr. Abdullah had visited Pakistan before, right after 47, and had he been handled a little differently with Quaid-e-Azam, who was arrogant, sick, whatever reasons, maybe the course of history would have been different. But we are not into ifs and buts. What I am interested is that like the Babri Masjid and the Ayodhya has a Muslim minority connection. Whether it is Mr. Akbar's point of view or Arif Muhammad Khan's point of view, there also is the Kashmir, where you can't discuss Kashmir without discussing the minorities, and you can't discuss the special position of Kashmir. But my interest in asking Mr. Habibullah is this, that he doesn't mention Kashmir in isolation. He also has an insider's view on the Assam Accord, which Mr. R.D. Pradhan was negotiating with. And my little peripheral connection with Rajiv Gandhi was thanks to Sam Pedroda, who took me to him as a Hindi translator for his speeches. And for a very short while, I could work with Mani and Mr. Akbar and Jairam Ramesh. And I think Mr. Pradhan, then, and Mr. Dhars, Vinay Dhars' father, Vijay Dhars' father, Kishan Amla used to be part of that group. Now, the interesting part, the father, Mr. Amla was his father.
No. Vijay Dhars' father was D.P. Dhar.
D.P. Dhar.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Kishan Amla is his brother-in-law.
Brother-in-law. But he was part of that group. Now, the interesting thing is that what he said, that Rajiv Gandhi was the first person I encountered and realized what charisma is, that he had grace, he had charm, and he could win you over. And you are doing this Odisha Literary Festival. I would recall very briefly an incident that we were recording a small video interview with him, and some carpenter would come, and Rajiv, before he retired for his lunch, told him, don't ruin the woodwork there, do it properly, and casually asked him, what is your name? So this Oriya carpenter said, Jagannath sir. And he went away, he said, I have the luxury, I can have my lunch and sleep and have a siesta. He came back after that for the interview. But the first thing he asked was this carpenter, addressing him by his first name. I said, Jagannath, have you had something to eat or not? So that is the kind of thing which you remember for a lifetime, that this is a man who can walk with the princes and paupers and not lose his touch. That was one part. The second part is that when we talk of Kashmir and Mr. Pradhan and these people, I think part of the problem with Rajiv's Camelot was that there were too many knights in shining armors fighting their own wars and crusades. So they had different ambitions, and Mr. Habibullah is an extremely interesting character. Like Prabhu Bhai said, he was a fly on the wall. He was not quite a fly in the wall, but he was a very typical old-fashioned Doon school boy turned into an IAS who would maintain his distance. Because another incident which he mentioned in his book, before I come to the peripheral, more Kashmir connection elsewhere, He does mention the very rather humiliating sacking of the Foreign Secretary Venkateshwar.
Yeah,
And
that's
then he says when Meera Shankar, who was then a much too junior deputy secretary or something,
spoke up.
took up cudgels on behalf of the colleague, the Rajiv was not only gracious, note on the file that who's more loyal than the Pope, and also allowed a graceful exit to Mr. Venkateshwar. But that doesn't absolve him of treating some civil servants of great seniority. And that is where I think the rot started, of people not having a spine, not having strong knees, bending down. And Mr. Habibullah is very kind not to mention those who served the state remaining silent and meant for all seasons, but then meant for all reasons where they are also in bureaucracy. Now, some of them were honorable who resigned from civil service and joined politics openly. Some waited till very long to resign from foreign service, late lamented J.P. Dixit, for instance. But the interesting part, what I wanted to ask Mr. Habibullah is that he goes into the Assam Accord. He goes into the Punjab Longowal Accord. Now, these two are again issues related to minorities. In Assam's case, the Muslims from Bangladesh and Hindus and Bengali speaking, but he also goes into Mizoram. So if you are talking of Mizoram and Nagaland, there are minorities, ethnic and religious, and Mr. Habibullah has been a chairperson of the Minorities Commission. I had the pleasure of interviewing him with my son at that stage, and we were very deeply impressed by his warmth and knowledge and objectivity at that stage also. But then he's the one who talks of Andaman, Nicobar and Lakshadweep. Now, why I'm mentioning all this in the context of Kashmir is that most of the time in these patriotic times, we say 10% of the Indian budget goes to Northeast, 10% of the Indian budget goes to Kashmir. Why should it go there? Why should the rest of the country pay the price of this? Now, Kashmir is the crown. Kashmir is the testament to Indian secularism. But what about Nagaland? What about Mizoram? What about Andaman? People remember his New Year party in Andaman and Nicobar with his friends. Or you don't even know what Lakshadweep is like. We only vaguely think of the tuna fish coming from that place. Now, my question to Mr. Habibullah would be that would he see a pattern in two things? He has been in the Indira Gandhi's office, and Jairam Ramesh has written a very nice biography, green biography of Mrs. Gandhi. The continuities in the policy, there is we are talking the opening of the Ayodhya Mosque, and we are giving the benefit of doubt at the moment, trusting Mr. Habibullah totally that Rajiv did not know. But Jairam Ramesh's biography of Indira Gandhi says about Chilika Lake and about Orissa, where we are talking the Orissa Literary Festival, that Mrs. Gandhi had to concede that she could not override the Navy's objections about declaring the Chilika Lake an eco-fragile area and not have development work there. So there were times when the Prime Minister was not an authoritarian dictator of a variety, where one could say that what the Prime Minister thought right would be done. So there were constraints, constitutional or bureaucratic or security concern. So that about the Chilika Lake and environmentalism. But what I would like to ask him is, Rajiv Gandhi के क्या concern environmental थे, क्या concern आपने Prime Minister's office को जब change किया from IAS to lateral entrance like Arun Nehru's and Arun Singh and other people, or even Sam Pitroda, what result that had on the integrity and efficiency of the civil service subsequently, and how the tragedy turned into triumph even in his lifetime because of this. How he subverted the civil service, how he was too good a public school boy to own up the guilt for others, from Amitabh Bachchan and his brother down to everybody else. These are all the questions I want him to answer in one go.
That's a tall order.
That's a whole lot of questions in a little. Let me answer it in a wider scope. The reform, yes, Rajiv was concerned. I've discussed that in detail with the administrative structure of the government of India and the Prime Minister's office. Yes, but as I have said in the book, early on in the book, these were aspirations. He saw the weaknesses here, but he was not able to come up with any solution finally, except on the periphery of Panchayati Raj, which of course didn't turn out the way he may have wanted. But the question is that, yes, lateral entry into the Prime Minister's office, no. Sam Pitroda was not inducted into the Prime Minister's office. The person who came in lateral entry into the Prime Minister's office was Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Jairam Ramesh also did not come in lateral entry into so far as Arun Singh and others came in, they came in as parliamentary secretaries. They were not they did not come into the structure that they became secretary to government or joint secretary to government or in the established positions in the PMO. But yes, he did experiment with the idea of having parliamentary secretaries instead of a secretary. And that didn't quite work out. And as I've said in my book also, by the end of his tenure, the Prime Minister's office was in fact more integral and integrated in the government of India when he started. But this is, and I've also mentioned, as Pushpesh said, that, in terms of the bureaucracy and its insensitivities, I have mentioned the fact of Dr. Alexander's virtual sacking from the office, and of course and I mentioned over there that the services can be particularly brutal with people who fell from favor. Of course, Dr. Alexander was then restored to authority and so on. But the question of the administrative structure and the bureaucratic structure in Rajiv's time was something he questioned all the time. He wanted to change it, but he was not able to change it. He would have needed another 5 years. And that is, he had clear intentions with regard to that. But he was not able to really implement those, except, as I said, in terms of Panchayati Raj, which was intended, and I may say this briefly here, which was intended actually to replace the existing structure of the district administration. Mind you, it's intended to replace it. It's not supposed to buttress or strengthen the district administration. It was expected to replace it, which it has not done. But that is now a part of the discussion.
Mr. Habibullah, may I also bring you back to what Pushpesh said, Kashmir, and you talk a lot about Mrs. Gandhi and her response to Farooq and, the showing of the naked asses on Iqbal Park, which really upset her a lot. And then you talk about the electoral rigging of 1987, which really began the downslide. Talk a little about the Kashmir that you saw and really when you feel the rot sort of set in.
Well, I wouldn't really say that there was a rot that set in. What I've tried to bring out in my book is that there was a canker in the very accession.
Right.
First of all, I've said that it is a particularly foolish thing for Pakistan to have done, to have launched that aggression. But as I was discussing in my book, there were probably other reasons for it. The problem was the Northwest Frontier,
right,
the NWSP, and the disaffection of the tribals. And they then tried to convert that disaffection into a jihad against in Kashmir. Here is a Muslim state, which is, although, as I've quoted Sardar Patel, in his letter to the Maharaja, he said, please opt for one state or another. And I can understand that. Because at that time, the problem was that we could not, neither India nor Pakistan could afford any state opting for independence.
Yeah.
Because if one said that, then you don't know how many others will start saying it. Also, it become a hell of a job then getting them back in. So so there was, and as Pushpesh has mentioned, the fact that now whether this A.M. Batali has mentioned in his book Intifada about Sheikh Abdullah going to Pakistan, but whether he went or didn't go, but Sheikh Mirza Afzal Beg and others certainly did, and they asked for an appointment. Now, this Mr. Jinnah seemed to be, what he was. He was a very arrogant, very person who was full of his own importance. So he felt that who are these sort of characters, political ruffians who want to meet me? I will speak to the Maharaja. I will speak to somebody in government. Who are these? So therefore, he didn't meet them. And therefore, as Pushpesh said, that the history might have been different. I don't know if it would have been very different because the ideology, and you being a Kashmiri yourself, Kaveri, you'll understand this, the ideology, the ideological framework, the religious ideological framework of Kashmir is rather different to that of Punjab and the Northwest. And the dominant power in Pakistan was the Punjabi, and the Kashmiris had the experience of actually being ruled by Punjab kingdom when they were ruled by the Sikh kingdom. Yeah. And in fact, Dogras were also part of the Punjab aristocracy, right, who then bought this state from the British after the defeat of the Sikhs. Now, so they wanted to opt out of that. Therefore, the stupidity in actually launching that invasion made there a huge surge of public opinion in favor of India, which is what Sheikh Abdullah called for.
Right.
And Sheikh Abdullah he came out in the Iqbal Park even before going to Pakistan and appealed that the best bet was India.
Yeah.
So that was, and as Pushpesh said, this was not this movement. This movement was a freedom movement, and then they came to the conclusion that if they wanted freedom, they would only find it in India, and that would be quite logical. You would understand that.
Yeah.
Being a Kashmiri yourself, you could understand that. That he would feel that here was a democratic country emerging as such. Pakistan was unstable; it was not known, and there the dominant class was the Muslim clergy, for who they were just scared of. So this is what went into the actual accession. Now, you asked me about where the rot set in. Unfortunately, it set in there because we refused, and I'm afraid this is a fault of all of us. We refused to accept the Kashmiris as Indians. Now, we often accuse the Kashmiris, when you go there, they talk of India and Kashmir, India and Kashmir and so on. And this is a complaint that I heard repeatedly. Yes, because they had thought, that is how they had thought of it in the beginning. And the reason lies in what Pushpesh mentioned. But the point was that it was for us to make them feel that they're one of us. We never succeeded in doing that. That is where the rot lay. And every step that happened thereafter that made them feel different made the matter worse. And for example, when you mentioned the election of 1987, elections one after the other. I participated in so many after the 1977 election. All of them were rigged outright, much worse than 1987. In 1987, there's a dispute, and I quoted Farooq Hashko and a detailed discussion with Farooq on that 1987 election. He's convinced that there was no rigging, but he admits that there was in certain polling booths tampering. But he says that was not only with the seats of the MUF, but certainly with the seats of the National Conference also. But that was because there was a tradition in J&K of tampering with elections. In 1977, I was DC Srinagar myself. And I can say, now I'm often credited with having staged a very fair and free election in 1977. But I can tell you it was not entirely free and fair. There was also fiddling with elections even then. Although the administration was against that idea. So that you see, all these things. So you say, when did the anchor set in? This idea that they are not going to get the freedom that they aspired to is the source of what you call the rot.
But I'll come in here because I was party to this decision was taken by Jagmohan in 1984, 1 month after Blue Star, and you were in the PMO, I think, at that time. And the government was dismissed. Farooq Abdullah lost the majority according to governor in his letter. I was sitting in his office when it happened, and Rajiv was secretary of the party at that time. But he must, because he must 1984 June, when the Blue Star took place?
Blue Star was 1984.
84, nah. This government
in June.
was also dismissed. It was dismissed a month later, I think.
The sacking of Farooq's government was a month later, 1984.
A month later, yes.
July 1984.
So you have not dealt in detail about that because the chasm between Gandhi Parivar and Farooq Abdullah Parivar suddenly was dismissed, and his brother-in-law was sworn in immediately in the same evening, and he lost within 1 month. So don't you think both this is Gandhi and Rajiv? I hope you are also consulted in the process there. You have not dealt with that in this book.
No, I have dealt with it in considerable detail. I've dealt with it in considerable detail. It comes under in a separate chapter. You have not probably seen it so far. It comes under a separate chapter. In 1984, in June, when Operation Blue Star took place, the whole of the Northwest became highly destabilized. Farooq went and held an operation conclave in Srinagar. Now, Mahmoodur Rahman was his principal secretary. I was joint secretary of the Prime Minister. I was not joint secretary, I was director of the Prime Minister's office. And I warned Mahmood, please tell him not to hold this conclave, because Mrs. Gandhi is extremely sensitive on this point, and because the whole of that area has become very unstable, she will be very put off if you go ahead with that conclave. He then consulted with Farooq and then called me back and said, yes, well, you see, this is only a meeting of opposition people, and Farooq will not say anything about Mrs. Gandhi at all. He will just talk about the unity of the opposition. So, I mean, I had my doubts about that, knowing Farooq that I do, but I kept quiet about it. It is not that Mrs. Gandhi was asking me to please tell them not to do it. I just gathered that from her conversations with me. Although she didn't tell me that, that may have been what she told her party people. But then he held that conclave. And in that conclave, I think he was carried away. He was extremely critical of Mrs. Gandhi. And that was followed. It was then she gave the signal to her governor, and Mr. Jagmohan is there. He will attest to this. It is then that she said that no, I want him out. Up to that time, she'd gone on saying, although she'd replaced the governor and all that, she'd gone on saying, no, we can't tamper. I don't know what will be the result of any fiddling with the elected government there. And in fact, there had been considerable achievement. In 1983, the elections were held in which she lost was a completely open and fair election, which Farooq had won hands down. Now, all these things having happened, the University 87 put the clock back and made the people feel that, well, this mirage of freedom which we were thinking was coming with the return of Sheikh Abdullah and things was only a mirage. Correct. And therefore, we are not going to get this unless there is this revolt. So, and of course, this was served up and assaulted by our friends, our friendly neighborhood, and so on. But this is how this process developed. And so far as Rajiv, let me go further with this.
Okay.
So far as Rajiv is concerned, as soon as now, even before, and I've written about this in the book, Farooq and I entered to it, even before when Rajiv was General Secretary, he was working on Mrs. Gandhi. We must now set things right, because by then the other issues were generally, stabilized. So then he was very keen that there should be an understanding with Farooq. And Mrs. Gandhi then reopened. She had a talk with Farooq. I've mentioned, after on her visit after Operation Blue Star, she visited Ladakh. And Farooq came to see her in Ladakh. And I've given in detail the meeting that Farooq had with her in Ladakh.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know, but Farooq himself just told me the meeting. She went up the wall, he said. And she started saying you did this, and of course, as has been said, that she talked about the arse, brazen arse, and all that. And she went for him. He didn't get a word. He wasn't able to say a word. And he came out totally disgruntled. And then, of course, the sacking came after that. But and she wasn't prepared to meet him. I had said that no, but he's chief minister, madam, and after you're visiting the state and so on. So she did see him. And then afterwards she told him, I only saw him because you told me so. And then that was the case. But by 31st of October, they had already reopened their discussion, and Farooq was waiting in Kashmir House. He had an appointment with Mrs. Gandhi on 31st of October. He was waiting to see her. When he got news, he was going to see her after that interview by Peter Ustinov. And he got the news that she had been assassinated there. Then when Rajiv came in, and I've described that in detail, what motivated him, he felt that we can't carry on the government of J&K like this. And therefore, he reached out to Farooq, and Farooq reached out to him. And that, of course, I've discussed in considerable detail as to what were the shortcomings. And that, accord, that Rajiv Farooq accord, had a great deal to do with the political element of that accord, was all negotiated by Rajesh Pilot. Yes. The economic concept of the economic content of that report was arrived at after considerable research, much of which was done by me over earlier accords. None of them had this huge economic package also to go with the accord. This was one accord which did have. Unfortunately, it did not deliver.
I'm discussing something else. You are given quite detailed information because it must be in the part where accord and discord you are discussing must be in that part chapter, which I have not read in detail. But when I was there in Srinagar at that point in time when GM Shah was sworn in, I was there and I witnessed to various things happen. But you are given a new perspective to the whole thing. The decision was taken first by Mrs. Gandhi to dismiss, then was created a minority government. Basically, decision was taken to dismiss what you are telling. Yes. And therefore, this whole style of converting a majority government into minority, which is happening now even, that model was first implemented in Srinagar by Mrs. Gandhi. Therefore, Kashmir Accord, how Kashmir discord became a discord between Abdullah. So this is an interesting revelation that how Congress party or the current party, they first take up their mind to appoint somebody or dismiss somebody, then create a legislative arithmetic. Is it?
Oh, well, I don't know if you can come to that conclusion. As I said, and I mentioned that in the book also, what made Kashmir special was the fact that it had a government where this conclave had taken place. It was building up an opposition to the center, and the center had this fear because of Operation Blue Star that the Northwest was unstable, and she could not afford to have a hostile government in power and then I've written this in the book also. After Operation Blue Star, she was told, and I've told you who I think told her that also, that Rajiv immediately went and started reaching out to the Sikhs. And reaching out to the Sikhs, according to her, according to what Farooq says, she was told that he reached out to Sikhs to instigate Sikhs against her. And he'd actually gone to the Gurudwara Chatti Patshahi in Hazratbal to meet the Sikhs and calm them down. Tell them, no, don't worry, we will do whatever is necessary, this has to be done and so on. This was reported to her, which is why she took the decision, no, he must go, and which is why she had these apprehensions. And actually, he was trying to do something else. He'd then gone and met Vindranwale. You remember that he'd gone and met Vindranwale at the Golden Temple. Some people there were conjecture at that time that perhaps he'd been sent by Mrs. Gandhi to meet him. There was also conjecture that no, he met him to show his defiance to Mrs. Gandhi. All these stories went on. In fact, it was quite simple. She had not been properly informed, and she was therefore very angry with him, which is what led to this. So I would not say that it became the start of a practice, because there were not situations of that nature easily presented in other states. This was primarily a security concern, so as far as she was concerned, and Mrs. Gandhi was very, very conscious of security, even more than her son.
Farooq was considered to be a security threat at that point in time.
Not that he was considered to be a security threat, but the manner of his behavior could be construed to be compromising, could compromise security. Not that he himself, she didn't, never, I don't think she ever had that apprehension. But he himself was going to come out without doing something.
You must have seen Jagmohan's report also recommending whatever he recommended.
I didn't see Jagmohan's report.
But I saw that report in which he never said about security aspirations at all. He just he lost the confidence, he can't provide a stable government. And because of that law and situation, the usual. Which came from the Prime Minister's office. I was sitting there when he came.
No, that's right. a governor's report is not one which will go into the intricacies of the political background. Because that is when she gave that is not when she decided that now let's dismiss him. That is when she gave license. Governor Jagmohan had from the beginning been pleading that let him go ahead and he will dismiss Farooq's government and replace it with governor's rule. Now she never agreed to that in any case. When Farooq's government was overthrown, it was not replaced, as you remember, with governor's rule.
Yeah, it was governor's rule because I can give you more bit
because for the reason
Narasimha Rao was the Home Minister at that point in time, isn't it?
That's right.
So I spoke to him later when he became the Prime Minister. He gave entirely different story, which I can't talk here now. I'll talk when I write my book.
Yes, do that. But in this case, since I was working with her on this issue of Kashmir, so far as her when she said in front of me that we can't we have to have an elected government in Kashmir. That went with her whole theory. She'd come to the Indira Sheikh Accord in order to try and restore democratic government in Kashmir after so many years of what I told you had been happening in that state. And she did not want to compromise that altogether, again replacing it with central rule. So she said that in Kashmir, we can never predict what is going to happen. And therefore, it is better if the government remains in Kashmiri hands. So, as you know, as you remember, Gulsha became the chief minister thereafter.
He survived for 40 days, I think.
And that became known as the curfew Raj, if you remember.
That's right.
Other thing which, Wajahat, I have not read it, you might have mentioned, because I have not read it. You're not, what was your perspective on the fight between Rajiv Gandhi and Gyani Zail Singh? That became a very, Gyani Zail Singh was the president at that point in time.
Yeah, I have not dwelt in detail on that.
Why I'm asking this question, because when Gyani Zail Singh accepted the post of the president, when only Rajiv called him. I was sitting in the Home Minister's office when Rajiv made the final call. Gyani ji, hum aapko Rashtrapati banana chahte hain. Then he told me, I broke the story first at that time. There was no social media at that time. There was something happening. So what I'm saying that so much of a relationship they had, good relationship they had. What went wrong? You were in the PMO at that time, and you have not dealt with this in the book in much detail, because that turned the whole thing. That turned the whole thing into something, and Rajiv lost the first Gandhi.
I have mentioned it. I have mentioned the fact that his relationship with Gyani Zail Singh had soured, but I have not, of course, gone into details as to why it had soured. There are various, and you, of course, know about it, so I don't need to dwell on that in greater detail. But the impression that I did get was that Gyani Zail Singh repeatedly felt that Rajiv was treating him with disrespect. He was not giving him the disrespect that he deserved. Not only that he deserved as the president of India, but as an elder in his party. That the second part.
KK Tiwari episode happened because he abused Gyani and he was dismissed and when.
So and that's probably because Rajiv did not have a very high regard for Gyani Zail Singh.
He changed his mind after selecting him.
Well, he unfortunately that may probably be the case, but I never discussed it with him, so I'm not in a position really to tell you that this was his attitude. But I do remember he tended to be not very respectful to Gyani Zail Singh, and it was my impression that the Gyani ji resented that because he was an elder.
That's a tragedy, because when I met Rajiv Gandhi in a plane first time in 1989, I went to Stockholm with him also. You were there, I think, in that trip.
No, I had gone on the subway on the visit to Russia.
That was the first time I went there with him, and Sharda Prasad was there. Later on, when that was the last interview which he gave, 89, went to Goa. Because when I was coming back with Rajiv Gandhi the day when Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated, and there was Mr. K.C. Singh, there was Mr. Bindra, there was Mr. Bhandari. There are certain things which I cannot disclose, but I can disclose one thing which I've written in my India Today, which I told Rajiv also. Gyani ji, when I went to meet him when he was in his cabin, he was almost disappointed. He was just, you can say, so much demoralized. I asked him, who are you going to meet? The Prime Minister. We were at 35,000 feet at that time. We were flying from Thana to Delhi. And he told me without letting, and I said, Rajiv Gandhi. So I don't know, I told Rajiv this. And I wrote in India Today at that time. And that's why the liking for Rajiv Gandhi, he was so committed, or I can say loyal to the Gandhi family. So I expected a person like you to write a book, because Gyani Zail Singh in my interview said, "Mere ko Indra ji jhadu lagane ke liye kahenge to main jhadu bhi lagaunga." So what went wrong? I expected, because people avoid this particular chapter of Gyani Zail Singh, Rajiv Gandhi. Nobody is willing to talk. Nobody is willing to write.
I would be willing to talk and write had I known anything about it. I never really discussed it with him. And I have therefore in my book discussed relationships with other people, who I knew. I have, of course, discussed his relationship with Arun Nehru. And that I've discussed in considerable detail on the issue of Babri and so on, and his falling from government. His relationship with VP Singh. For example, when VP Singh resigned, he was completely taken aback. He didn't realize why he had resigned. But these are things that there will always be things that I was not aware.
No, VP Singh episode is one thing which you are not dealt in detail in this chapter, your book also. That is another missing part. Why, I don't know. Because Gyani Dayal Singh changed the history of Indian politics and the Congress party itself. And these are the chapters which were expected for many people to write. I will be writing, of course, when I think I
then now there's if I'd written everything myself, then there would have been nothing there for you to write.
Because VP Singh, when he resigned, I was with him in the plane from Visakhapatnam to Delhi. He was defense minister. When I came back, and it was the 10th of March or 10th of January, 12th of January, India Today issue was to come out, and he resigned, and we were the first magazine to come out the same day when he resigned. So he told me in advance, I'm not disclosing it, that I'm going to resign. So that is why he resigned. What happened? These are different issues, because I was expecting this book to see that part of the story, that why did he resign? And the last meeting which we tried to hold Rajiv Gandhi and VP Singh together was midnight in the night. I don't know whether you are aware of it or not. There was other journalists with me. We went to Rajiv Gandhi's house, two of us, with VP Singh, and that was the end of the meeting. After that, it was resignation.
Yeah, well, I've discussed in the book also why the reasons ascribed to VP Singh for his resignation are not really valid reasons. That I've discussed in the book.
Yeah, you discussed that. That's what I'm saying. You discussed, because what the reasons I know are different than what you have discussed.
Possibly,
yes. It is perception, but
possibly no. But you see, and I have found also that on the basis of the same facts, people may come to different conclusions.
Right.
Correct, you're right. You're absolutely right. Because the only facts which are count, because why was shifted from finance ministry to defense? The facts are facts.
Yeah, that's correct.
No, facts are facts. Who are being investigated, not investigated. They're part of the archives. And when Atalji became the prime minister, I had certain access to certain documents at that time. So facts are facts. So these are the two chapters which are very important in the history of Rajiv Gandhi and Congress party.
But on that case, on that, I have commented that on the case of his transfer from finance to defense in the context of BOFAs, I have discussed that in my book.
Yeah, you discussed that. I read at a little bit. I read it, because that's why I'm keeping quiet on that particular thing. Anyway, Pushpa, you want to ask any question?
The only thing I want to ask Mr. Habibullah is that we still have left the Northeast out of this. And Assam and the Accord and the Citizenship Amendment Act and the registration are topics of interest now. And this was something which was, again, one of the major milestone landmarks in his time, the Assam Accord. And then it didn't seem to quite, go the way it should have gone. And it continues to be a festering sore.
I think I have discussed it in considerable detail. Also, I had the benefit of consultation with Sandra Hazarika on the question of Assam. I've also discussed Mizoram in considerable detail, which was a success story. The Assam Accord was...
Permit me to interrupt at this stage. A success story in times of Rajiv. But if you talk of triumphs and tragedies, the triumph is a certain fleeting moment where you celebrate the triumph. And the tragedy, further generations come to live through. So if the Naga Accord is not settled even today, the Lichai Naga Hills, the Mizo problems, the extended Nagaland remains a major problem.
It is. And the brew problem in Mizoram. There's as you know, the brew problem. But coming back to Assam, and there I have, of course, dealt extensively. My reference book, Myron Miner's book had come out just about that time. That he was entering into these accords in the Northeast in the 1970s, in the late 1970s was Miner's book, and it was a very fresh book at that time when I was in the PMO. And I took a great deal of time reading it in order to give the inputs which Rajiv was looking for. I did not have much to do with the Assam Accord. It was Mr. Pradhan who was really looking after it and working directly with Rajiv. I had a little more to do with the Mizo Accord because I had been associated with that in the time with Mrs. Gandhi also. And I'd gone with her to Mizoram. And so on. The perspectives of Weiner were brought into all these. Unfortunately, what happened in Assam is that in conceding the demands of the major community of Assam. It triggered off, and I think this is a lesson that we should learn. It triggered off a host of other demands, and I've described those in the book, the Bodos and so on and so forth, and each group then wanting its own area, which is what this is what had led to the Assam, as you know, was Assam as the whole of the Northeast earlier. Mizoram and Meghalaya and all. Shillong was the capital of Assam. I know this because my first memories in life when I was 2 years old was when my father was posted as the sub-area commander in Shillong. So, and in fact, I mentioned that also in the book because that was the time that was being negotiated for the border between Bangladesh and Sylhet and so on, and Assam. And the chief minister of that time had taken a stand and handed over a portion of what was originally Assam and Sylhet to Bangladesh, and he was strongly criticized for that. But that is how it will be. The Bengalis then became a minority in Assam. Otherwise, they were to become a majority. But anyway, those are other stories. But this is this led to the Assam Accord, led to the escalation to what can you call escalation of other separatist tendencies, which were already rampant in that area, which had resulted in the creation of those separate states in the Northeast. And it all stems from the way that Assam, which had been the Ahom kingdom, had been an independent kingdom for years, and was ceded to India by Burma, who were not the rulers of Assam at all, ceded to British India, and that was in fact the Kankan, and the rest is a long story, and of course I can't cover it here. But I think you'll find some answers in the book. But as Amartya Sen says, that a good book, which I hope this one is, raises more questions than it answers.
Absolutely right. That's why I'm asking so many questions, because you put it together. History also, there are too much of history there, which I have not read it here. You try to put the contemporary politics with historical perspective as
That's
well,
right.
which is you have tried to
I hope it raises more questions.
No, the question which I'm going to raise, one more question which I have seen here. Odisha poverty event, he was concerned about poverty and whatnot, and then Kala Handi story which we wrote.
Kala Handi and Fulbani.
India Today wrote a cover story on that time.
Yes.
That death, hunger, drought, and we got a nasty letter from Mani Shankar Iyer, who was at that time because don't you think that Rajiv Gandhi was guided more by what I call the doom school of thought, that you must go aggressively and deny everything? Because you have spoken about Rajiv's men, in which most of them are doom school boys. You have not spoken about politicians at all, except Arun Singh, yourself, and even that Alu Alia who was there in the AICC. And you have spoken about those three doom schools. So what do you think that Rajiv, when we wrote a story and we were convinced our facts were right, he was worried about poverty. There was hunger, dress. Even the chief minister who was there at that time, Janaki Vallabh Patnaik, I think, was the chief minister at that time. And I met him, and I showed him the letter also. He said, "You are talking about my prime minister and his best doom school boy," because at that time, Suman Dubey, everybody was doom school. He was in the government. Suman, my boss and good boss, he was there who hired me also. He was additional secretary in the I&B ministry at that time. So what I'm asking you, Rajiv, as a personality, was more guided by his schoolmate or peer group rather than the politicians?
When I was writing this book, and I sent it to various peers, as you say, references to look through the thing, they pointed out I tended to cite Doskos, and obviously that is not really correct. Was he guided by a kind of I would call a Dosko school of thought? No, he was freer maybe in speaking to Doskos, but he was not guided. I can't say he was guided by us at all. He was a person who was very open to ideas, and I've tried to mention cases there. Like getting hold of a person like Bijon Mishra, who was an activist, a consumer activist.
Right.
And he just heard him speaking somewhere. Even his meeting with Sam Pitroda. Vijay Dhar had met Sam Pitroda, and while he's talking to him, he said, "You're a friend of Rajiv Gandhi's, and I have these ideas." He mentioned that to Rajiv, and then Vijay, then Rajiv sent for Sam Pitora. So he was very open to ideas. This was how he was advised. People like that. Jairam Ramesh was very much younger. He came in only at the end. Even when he would speak to Rajiv, Rajiv was always open to what he had to say. This chap, this editor of Hard News, Pradeep Kapoor.
Pradeep Kapoor.
He's related a story of how he would go and speak to Rajiv, and Rajiv would listen. That was, in fact, Rajiv's strength, but I fear also may have been a weakness, because he listened to everybody. He listened to all. And I mentioned in that book that it is a characteristic of his, which I also share, being very, very trusting. In his case, it was, in my view, a strength, but you may certainly say that it is a failing, because it is what cost him his life.
Wajahat, I'm asking because I was covering Congress party very closely. All of them were friends. You might say whatever. Even now, I have more friends in the Congress party than I have in the other party. And they would confide in me what was happening with Rajiv Gandhi. Because he was a newcomer in the party, and there were old people whom I knew very well before Rajiv came into politics.
Yes, of course.
उनका सबका कहना ऐसा हिंदी में जो है, सब कहते कान का कच्चे थे राजीव गांधी. Because I am saying this because I am a witness to something which he spoke to me in Rashtrapati Bhavan when the first Republic Day thing happened. After he had sacked R.K. Dhawan and everybody and got some new people there, which you referred to, Winston George and somebody you ever referred in that, because I'm not going to Veer Bahadur Singh, because Veer Bahadur Singh used to come to my office after meeting Arun Nehru and Rajiv Gandhi both and tell me what happened. So I'm coming to only that particular instance where he told me about an industrial group. We were talking about them, and he said, "वो तो बहुत ही बदमाश हैं, they control everything in this country, and I will fix them." I'm using the word "I'll fix them." I've written down in my diary time and.
किसने कहा I'll fix them?
Rajiv Gandhi ने.
अच्छा.
He was telling me as Prime Minister, and later on, they got the benefit, and everybody else who was opposed to them was fixed. I'm not going into elaborate matter. So, कान का कच्चा का मतलब क्या होता है? Was he कान का कच्चा, or he was, as you saying, he was a listener. He used to listen to everybody. But Congress party at that point in time felt that he was most of the senior people. वो कान के कच्चे थे.
इसीलिए वो समझते थे कि कान के कच्चे. But this charge is even made by some against Mrs. Gandhi कि कान की कच्ची. You may construe it that way. It is true that he gave ear to everybody who wanted to express a view to him. I would not therefore say that it is because he can't get. There was one failing which he had, which I think he had got over by the time he had been leader of the opposition for several years, having known him for some time. Because as you saw, his ascending to that high position was very brief. He had no real political experience at all. He had not been an active, unlike his brother, he had not been an active participant in politics at all. He had always been there to help his mother. He'd always gone out of his way to help his mother. That means accompanying her, taking her here and there, doing all that, but not really assisting very much in her politics. Now, that being the case, the people who had been working with her would probably have thought कि हर एक की बात सुनता है, जो भी चाहता है जाके उनको बताना शुरू कर देता है.
होता तो वही था जो लास्ट आदमी कह के जाता था.
नहीं, ऐसा भी नहीं है ना. That would be कान का कच्चा would be that. कान का कच्चे का मतलब ये नहीं है कि हर एक की बात सुनना. कान के कच्चे का मतलब ये है कि लास्ट आदमी की जो बात है वही. But that was not the case. And that I can vouch for because
I must admit, he was a very charming person.
No. That is where I come in. You see, that is how, and I think the value of my work is that. Because he would often discuss them with me, ideas that had come to him. And he would often mention those ideas openly. And I mentioned the case in a meeting of the Planning Commission, when they were discussing this Indira Gandhi Awas Yojana. He came up with some outrageous suggestions.
Right.
Those were suggestions that he'd received from various people. He placed this before the Planning Commission. Now, Indira Gandhi ke zamane mein, she would listen largely to what people had, the cabinet or the committee or anyone had to say. And then at the end of it, she would give her view. So that view was not a view, it was a decision, it was an order. But she would give it as a view. Don't you think we should do it this way? That meant you do it this way. But in his case, he actually meant argue it, discuss it. So when you take Khan Kacha, that is true. He was always open to an argument and contradiction and ideas. And he would change his view. And I think that the example I've given to you about Shahbanu is a very good example of that.
Yeah.
He completely changed. Initially, I thought he's going to go by what I have suggested to him, but he then went by the advice of MJ Akbar. Whether that was, he did not. You can't accept somebody come off the street and tell you something. You yahi baat thi hai. This is not the case. MJ Akbar was an established, young, rising editor. And you can imagine, I mentioned in the book also that Rajiv would have thought that, yes, here's a young Muslim who is modern thinking, who is giving me these ideas. Therefore, I would not quite concur with this thing. Wrong decisions is having come to wrong decisions on this basis. And I can also understand by experienced old party people would tell you कि ये तो कान हरे की बात सुनता फिरता हमारी बात मानता नहीं.
Rajiv Gandhi, one book NK Singh is also written there, which talks about who made the Prime Minister office more powerful. In your book, you say the first time Principal Secretary was appointed by Mrs. Gandhi,
Sorry, I didn't
in
get
1971. But this Mr. NK Singh had written in the book that Prime Minister office became more powerful than the Cabinet Secretary when Principal Secretary was appointed by Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri in the Prime Minister's office. But you are saying the first time Principal Secretary was appointed when Mrs. Gandhi 71. Which one is correct? And because there was no Principal Secretary in Lal Bahadur Shastri's time.
That's right. The first Principal Secretary appointed to the Prime Minister was Mr. Haksar was the first Principal Secretary.
Correct.
Mr. Haksar was the first Principal Secretary, and this is very clearly, lucidly explained in Jairam Ramesh's book as to why he was appointed Principal Secretary and so on. So that is there. But in Rajiv's time, he thought of, as I mentioned, he thought of doing away with the position of Principal Secretary, but came back to it by the end of his time. B.G. Deshmukh was appointed as Principal Secretary. Sarla Grewal was only appointed as Secretary.
Correct.
And before him, there were parliamentary secretaries. Before her, there were parliamentary secretaries. So that's why I said he thought in terms of restructuring the Prime Minister's office and others, but this remained an aspiration.
Mr. Habibullah, you also suggest that Mr. Deshmukh was the one who actually asked for the withdrawal of security cover on Mr. Gandhi.
This is what I was told by a colleague of mine, whose name I have not mentioned in the book because he asked that it should not be mentioned, who was there in the cabinet meeting of Mr. V.P. Singh, where this matter came up, and Mr. V.P. Singh asked for his opinion because he was a senior bureaucrat, and he gave this opinion that, and I can understand that would have been the answer of a bureaucrat, but I would also have expected that particular person would have mentioned the fact that Rajiv was under grave security threat of his own.
Yeah. I'd just like to end, if I may, thank you so much, all of you. I'd just like to end, if I may, with the very personal story that Mr. Habibullah has also mentioned. He's talked about the bulletproof vest that Rajiv actually gifted him. And he ends by saying that, perhaps he should have worn it that day, that fateful day in Sri Perumbudur. It's very moving. Mr. Habibullah, would you like to talk a little about that?
Yes, I got this call. I had been in Srinagar and there had been an attack on me outside the Jami Masjid. I'd been fired at, and in fact, the DSP who was with me, Mr. Shaw, lost his life. Another person who was shopping at that time, a woman, lost her life. And my life was only saved because I hadn't taken the direct route back to the road to where my car was parked, but went round. Those of you who know Srinagar windows of the Jami Masjid is in a sunken area,
correct.
and you have to go out round it and then climb up the stairs and go up to the main road. So I then ran around it, and the chap ran behind me with a gun, and he was stopped by this chap who went by the name of Mustaqul Islam, but who didn't want me. I assume that he didn't want me dead. He wanted to kidnap me because that would have served a better purpose for them. But the younger fellow probably got emotional and thought he'd bumped me off altogether. And so Rajiv heard about this, and 2 days later, I got a call from George saying that a parcel is coming to you from Indian Airlines. Please have it collected. So I said, I'll do that. What is this parcel? So he said, you'll see. So when then 2 days later, a call came from Indian Airlines. Of course, they said, where can we send? I was commissioner. So they weren't going to ask me to come and collect it. They said, where can we send this parcel? What is your address? And when I opened the parcel, it was a bulletproof vest. I've still got that vest. When after he'd passed away, in fact, when I came down to Delhi, I was at that time still in Kashmir, and I came down to Delhi, and I went to Teen Murti Bhavan, where his body had been arranged in state, and near him was on the side where these people, the family members, were sitting there, and Sonia was sitting there, and of course I passed by, and I hurried down and said namaskar to her, and she said this with her hand. So I went up to her, and she said to me that, Rajiv was very worried about you. Did you receive the bulletproof vest? Now, as you can imagine, I had tried to be cool and calm at that time, but I completely broke. And then that is the tale. I've still got that vest.
Yeah.
I then asked her later on, because I became secretary of the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, and she set up that museum in the IGMT. I said that, don't you think that vest should be displayed at the IGMT museum? Because they've got a special room, in which all things, his clothes and things are displayed. Rajiv's clothes are displayed, which he was wearing on that last day. And she said, no, he wanted you to have it. So you have to keep it. I have it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There's this and a lot else for people to read and to enjoy, to savor, and also perhaps to feel bad about when you look at where India is.
I like this picture. Very smile.
Yeah. And he was really India's first 21st century man. And, I wonder what India would have been like under him.
Well,
thank you so much.
That is what I have said in my book, that he has to be judged by how far he was able to bring India into the 21st century.
Yeah.
That was his election problem.
Thank you so much, all three of you. It was such a pleasure to listen to all of you. Thank you, Pushpesh. Thank you, Mr. Chawla. Thank you, Mr. Habibullah.
Thank you, all friends, and thank you,
Thank you for the book, sir. Thank you very much for the book.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this session. If you would like to know more about OLF 2020 or watch other videos, please visit newindianexpress.com and eventexpress.com. If you are more of a social media person, please visit our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channels.